They called it a war for freedom, but for those who lived it, freedom was the first casualty. In the jungles of Vietnam, a superpower with infinite firepower met a people who refused to surrender. Politicians called it strategy, soldiers called it survival, and for millions caught in between, it was a nightmare with no front lines. This is not just the story of a war, it's the story of how hope, pride, and power collided in the heart of Southeast Asia. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us keep history alive, one story at a time. You are watching Erahive, where history speaks. Roots of resistance. Before the Americans, before the Cold War, there was already a war, one that had lasted for centuries. Vietnam's story was never just about ideology. It was about survival. A land carved by rivers and rice fields, where the soil itself remembered invasion after invasion, from the Chinese dynasties to the French Empire. Every generation of Vietnamese had learned the same lesson. Freedom was never given. It was fought for, inch by inch. In the mid-1800s, French gunboats sailed into the port of Da Nang, preaching civilization and progress. But behind their polished words lay hunger for land and profit. They built cathedrals and railroads, schools and plantations, symbols of modernity for some, monuments of humiliation for others. Vietnamese farmers watched as their crops fed foreign markets, and their children learned French instead of their own history. Resistance simmered quietly in the villages, like a pot waiting to boil. Then, in the early 1900s, a restless young man left Vietnam on a French steamship. His name was Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. The world would one day know him as Ho Chi Minh. He traveled through Asia, Europe, even America, working odd jobs, absorbing ideas, and searching for a way to free his homeland. In 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, he handed U.S. President Woodrow Wilson a petition demanding independence for Vietnam. Wilson, who spoke of freedom for all nations, never even read it. The message was clear: the West's freedom did not include Vietnam. Betrayed but not broken, Ho turned to a new doctrine sweeping the world: communism. He saw in it not tyranny, but the only ideology that promised to end colonial rule. For him, Marx's words were not about class struggle, they were a blueprint for liberation. He began gathering exiles, workers, and students under one goal: to make Vietnam free. Then came World War II. Japan invaded Vietnam, pushing aside the French colonial government. Ho Chi Minh saw his chance. He returned home and formed the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. Their cause was simple: fight the occupiers, reclaim the nation. Guerrilla bands, dressed in rags, armed with stolen rifles, struck Japanese patrols in the mountains and vanished into the mist. Ironically, the United States, desperate to weaken Japan, supplied Ho's fighters with weapons. In those days, the man who would become America's enemy was its wartime ally. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the moment Ho had waited for arrived. In Ba Dinh Square, before a crowd of thousands, he read Vietnam's Declaration of Independence, borrowing words straight from the American one: all men are created equal. The people wept. The dream of freedom felt close enough to touch, but the world's new order had other priorities. France, humiliated in Europe, refused to lose its colony in Asia, and America, now gripped by fear of communism's spread, quietly backed France's return. Once again, Vietnam's dream of independence was betrayed, traded away in the name of global strategy. The First Indochina War erupted in 1946. The French fought to reassert control. The Viet Minh fought for their land. Villages burned, jungles echoed with gunfire, and for 8 relentless years, both sides bled. In 1954, French troops fortified a valley called Dien Bien Phu, confident their superior firepower would crush the rebels. But Ho's general, Vo Nguyen Giap, had other plans. His soldiers dragged heavy artillery through mountains by hand, hidden beneath camouflage and mud. For 55 days they bombarded the French fortress until it fell. France's empire in Indochina collapsed, and Vietnam stood victorious. But victory came with a price. At the Geneva Conference, world powers divided the nation in two: communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, and the U.S. backed South Vietnam, governed from Saigon. They promised nationwide elections in 1956, a chance for the people to choose their destiny. Those elections would never happen. The country that had fought so long to be united was now split by ideology, foreign interests, and fear. One Vietnam dreamed of independence through communism. The other clung to promises of democracy securely under American protection. Between them lay a fragile ceasefire line, and beneath it, the seeds of the next Great War. The battle for Vietnam's soul was far from over. It was only changing hands. The domino gamble. The ink was barely dry on the Geneva Accords when the world's next great rivalry took hold of Vietnam. To the north stood Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, poor but united under the red banner of revolution. To the south stood the newly formed Republic of Vietnam, propped up by the United States and led by Nhu Dinh Diem, a devout Catholic ruling over a Buddhist majority. The line between them, the 17th parallel, was more than a border. It was a fault line between two worlds. President Dwight D. Eisenhower looked at that line and saw more than just Vietnam. He saw a row of dominoes stretching across Asia. If one fell to communism, he feared the rest would tumble after it. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even Indonesia. The Cold War had found its new battleground. In Saigon, Nhu Dinh Diem promised stability, order, and resistance to communism. Washington embraced him as a hero, but behind his polished speeches and American aid, Diem's South Vietnam was crumbling from within. He trusted only his family, silenced his critics, and filled his government with loyalists instead of leaders. Villagers were taxed into poverty, opponents were jailed or executed, and corruption seeped through every level of power. While the United States sent advisors, money, and weapons, Diem ruled not as a democrat but as an autocrat. North of the demilitarized zone, Ho Chi Minh watched closely. His dream of a united Vietnam hadn't died. It had only been delayed. When Diem canceled the promised reunification elections in 1956, Ho realized peaceful unification was impossible. The Viet Minh reorganized into a new force, the National Liberation Front, known to the Americans as the Viet Cong. They were not a single army, but a network of farmers by day, fighters by night, moving through jungles, rivers, and tunnels like ghosts. Their mission was simple: to reunite the country and drive out foreign influence once again. By the late 1950s, South Vietnam was bleeding from within. Government officials were ambushed on rural roads, villages were overrun, and fear spread faster than orders from Saigon. Yet Washington's reports painted a different picture, one of progress, discipline, and hope. The illusion of control comforted those far from the battlefield. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, he inherited a world on edge, Berlin divided, Cuba in crisis, and Vietnam slipping through America's fingers. Kennedy saw Vietnam as a test of will. If we can't stop communism there, his advisors warned, we can't stop it anywhere. And so, he sent more advisors, more helicopters, more money, and eventually more blood. By the end of his presidency, over 16,000 U.S. military personnel were in Vietnam, officially labeled as advisors, unofficially acting as soldiers. But even as American presence grew, the South Vietnamese government grew weaker. Diem's regime persecuted Buddhists, crushing protests and censoring the press. In 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thish Quang Duc sat cross-legged in a busy Saigon intersection, poured gasoline over himself, and lit a match. The world watched in silence as he burned not out of despair, but defiance. His death exposed what America had tried to ignore. Its ally was becoming its liability. That same year, South Vietnamese generals, with quiet encouragement from Washington, staged a coup. Diem was assassinated, along with his brother. The people cheered, but the joy was short-lived. In place of one corrupt regime came many weak, divided, and scrambling for power. South Vietnam's government would collapse and reform over and over again, each version weaker than the last. Then, in Dallas, the world shifted once more. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited a fragile South Vietnam, an emboldened North, and a Cold War ideology that left no room for retreat. In the jungles, the Viet Cong grew stronger, supplied by China and the Soviet Union through a secret web of trails winding through Laos and Cambodia. For every village America fortified, 3 more slipped under Viet Cong control. For every insurgent killed, 2 more took his place. By 1964, War, the United States faced a choice: double down or pull back. And then, one August night in the Gulf of Tonkin, an event occurred or seemed to occur that would change everything. Radar blips, torpedoes in the dark, confusion on the waves. The report said North Vietnamese boats had attacked a U.S. destroyer. The evidence was uncertain, but the consequences were not. President Johnson saw his opening. He went before Congress, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, granting him the power to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The dominoes had begun to fall, and soon American sons would follow them halfway across the world into a war they were told they could win. The Jungle War. By 1965, the United States had crossed the point of no return. What began as a war of advisors and promises had turned into a full-scale invasion. President Lyndon B. Johnson, determined not to be the man who lost Vietnam, authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign meant to break the enemy's will. But in Vietnam, willpower was stronger than bombs. American firepower filled the skies, B-52 bombers rained destruction across the north, and jungles erupted in fire. Villages vanished beneath napalm, rivers turned black from burning oil, and the soil itself seemed to scream. Yet, for every crater left behind, new Viet Cong fighters emerged from tunnels below. They didn't fight for territory or politics, they fought for home. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang. They were greeted by cheering locals and waving flags, but behind the smiles lay uncertainty. Many Vietnamese didn't know if these new soldiers were saviors or the next wave of occupiers. Within months, more than 200,000 American troops filled Vietnam's jungles, rivers, and mountains. They had the world's most advanced technology: helicopters, tanks, napalm, and M16 rifles. Yet they found themselves fighting an invisible enemy. The Viet Cong were everywhere and nowhere. They blended into villages, slipped through tunnels, and used the jungle as both shield and weapon. Every shadow could hide a sniper, every path could conceal a landmine. American patrols walked through rice paddies, never knowing if the next step would be their last. To counter this, the U.S. unleashed overwhelming power. Entire forests were sprayed with Agent Orange, a toxic chemical meant to strip the trees bare and expose the enemy. It poisoned the soil, the rivers, and generations of Vietnamese families. In the name of saving villages, American troops burned them to the ground. The grim phrase spread through the ranks: "We had to destroy it to save it." Back home, officials in Washington spoke of body counts and kill ratios, as if the war could be measured in numbers. They said America was winning, that victory was just around the corner. But for the soldiers on the ground, victory was a mirage. They fought for hills one week, abandoned them the next. They watched friends fall to ambushes, mines, and disease. Many began to ask themselves what they were truly fighting for: freedom, communism, or pride. The jungle took everything from them: comfort, certainty, even trust. Their M16 rifles jammed in combat. Their boots rotted from the swamp water, leeches fed on their skin, and nightmares fed on their sleep. The Viet Cong called them giant with feet of clay. By the end of 1967, over 20,000 Americans were dead. Yet generals assured the public that the enemy was close to collapse. They said there was light at the end of the tunnel, but that light was not victory, it was fire. Because in the coming year, North Vietnam would gamble everything in one daring strike, a nationwide offensive meant to shatter the illusion of American success and change the course of the war forever. The Tet Lunar New Year was coming, and with it, the storm. In early 1968, Vietnam prepared to celebrate Tet, the Lunar New Year, a time for peace, family, and renewal. For months, both sides had agreed on a truce. Firefights faded, soldiers relaxed, and Saigon buzzed with fireworks instead of gunfire. But beneath the calm, North Vietnam was preparing the most audacious operation of the war, one that would strike not just the American army, but America's belief in victory itself. On the night of January 30th, 1968, the illusion shattered. 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers launched a coordinated assault across the south, attacking over 100 cities, military bases, and provincial capitals. The Tet Offensive had begun. In Saigon, gunfire erupted outside the U.S. Embassy. Guerrillas breached the walls and fought American Marines room by room. In Hue, one of Vietnam's most ancient cities, the battle raged for nearly a month, street by street, house by house. The perfume river ran red, and in every corner of the South, the message was clear: the enemy was far from defeated. For weeks, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces fought back fiercely. By every military measure, they won. Thousands of Viet Cong were killed, and the offensive eventually failed to hold any territory. But on television, it didn't look like victory. For the first time in history, Americans watched war live from their living rooms, burning villages, wounded soldiers, and chaos in the streets. The government had promised progress, but what the people saw was collapse. The images told a different truth. A South Vietnamese officer executed a captured Viet Cong prisoner on camera, a single gunshot that echoed around the world. In another clip, terrified civilians ran through smoke and fire, clutching children. At home, students marched, veterans burned their draft cards, and mothers wept in front of the White House gates. The question was no longer how to win, it was why they were fighting at all. President Lyndon B. Johnson, worn down by years of war and growing protest, finally broke. In March 1968, he went on television and shocked the nation. He would halt the bombing of North Vietnam, seek peace talks, and he would not run for re-election. The most powerful man in the world had been undone, not by an army, but by a war he could no longer defend. That spring, as peace seemed within reach, tragedy struck again. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, and Robert F. Kennedy, a leading voice against the war, was killed in June. Cities burned, campuses erupted, and America, like Vietnam, was being torn apart from within. When the dust of 1968 settled, a new face emerged, promising order and an end to chaos. Richard Nixon. He vowed to restore peace, bring the troops home, and achieve what he called peace with honor. But behind those words was a truth he could never admit. America had already lost what it came to defend. The Tet Offensive didn't just shift the battlefield, it shifted history. The war that had begun in the jungles of Vietnam had now come home into the hearts and living rooms of millions who no longer believed. Yet for the soldiers still fighting, the orders remained the same. Keep pushing, keep fighting, even when the reason was long gone. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, America was a nation at war with itself. 58,000 troops were still in Vietnam. The protests at home had turned from marches to mass movements. Families were divided. Faith in government was collapsing. Nixon's promise to end the war and bring peace with honor sounded like salvation, but in truth, it was the beginning of another deception. His plan was called Vietnamization, a slow transfer of responsibility from American troops to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. On paper, it meant empowering South Vietnam to defend itself. In reality, it meant a slow withdrawal while trying to save face. American forces would pull out, but the bombing wouldn't stop, it would expand. While Nixon spoke of peace, U.S. warplanes secretly bombed Cambodia and Laos, countries officially neutral but deeply tied to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Villages were erased from maps, and jungles once again caught fire. In Saigon, the government celebrated progress, but corruption ate away at everything. The ARVN depended on American weapons, American money, and American air cover. Alone, it could not stand. The war dragged on in the shadows. Each year, more U.S. soldiers returned home, some in uniform, others in body bags. Those who survived brought back wounds the world couldn't see. Guilt, anger, confusion. They were met not with parades, but protests, baby killers. Some were called words that cut deeper than shrapnel. For the first time in American history, the soldiers were fighting two wars, one abroad and one at home. Then came the event that changed everything, the My Lai massacre. In 1968, a U.S. platoon entered a small Vietnamese village, searching for Viet Cong fighters. Instead, they slaughtered over 500 unarmed civilians, men, women, and children. When the truth surfaced years later, it shattered whatever trust remained. The war wasn't just unwinnable, it was unforgivable. By 1972, Nixon was desperate for a way out that looked like victory. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, entered secret peace talks with North Vietnam in Paris. But as negotiations faltered, Nixon resorted to force once again. That December, he unleashed Operation Linebacker II, the so-called Christmas bombing. For 12 days, Hanoi and Haiphong were pounded with explosives. More than 1,600 civilians were killed. Entire neighborhoods turned to ash. Then, as quickly as it began, the bombing stopped. 6 weeks later, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. America promised to withdraw its troops, North Vietnam promised to release prisoners of war, and both sides agreed to a ceasefire. ceasefire. On the 29th of March, 1973, the last American combat soldiers left Vietnam, but peace was an illusion. The U.S. had withdrawn, yet the fighting never ended. North and South Vietnam resumed their war almost immediately. Nixon had promised South Vietnam that America would return with air support if the North attacked again. But by 1974, the Watergate scandal had exploded. Nixon resigned in disgrace, and Congress, weary of lies and death, cut off all aid to Saigon. As the bombs stopped falling, silence swept over the land. But it wasn't peace, it was the calm before collapse. In Hanoi, victory was no longer a question of if but when. And in Saigon, a new word began to spread: evacuation. By 1975, the war's final act had begun. South Vietnam was unraveling. Its army was exhausted, its government corrupt, and its people terrified. Without American air support or funding, it was only a matter of time. The North Vietnamese army advanced with quiet determination, city after city, province after province, falling like dominoes, not to ideology, but to inevitability. In Saigon, panic spread faster than gunfire. Rumors of invasion filled the air. Families packed whatever they could carry: papers, jewelry, photographs, and fled toward the sea, hoping for one last chance at escape. The U.S. Embassy became the final symbol of hope. Outside its gates, thousands pressed against the walls, pleading to be taken. On the 29th of April 1975, as North Vietnamese tanks closed in, Operation Frequent Wind began the largest helicopter evacuation in history. U.S. Marines guarded the embassy rooftop as choppers ferried evacuees to ships waiting offshore. Each helicopter lifted families, soldiers, and embassy staff, then returned for more. Again and again, until the decks were so crowded that the pilots had no choice but to push helicopters into the sea to make room for others. Below, Saigon was collapsing. By dawn on April 30, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city's streets, crushing the gates of the presidential palace. A soldier raised the red flag with the yellow star. The Republic of Vietnam, the nation America had fought 2 decades to defend, ceased to exist. For the first time in its history, the United States had lost a war. But for Vietnam, the victory came with unbearable cost. After 3 decades of conflict, more than 2 million civilians were dead, along with 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, and 58,000 Americans. Villages lay in ruins. The land itself had been poisoned. In the years that followed, the new communist government began a harsh campaign of re-education. Soldiers, officials, and civilians loyal to the South were sent to prison camps, many for years, some never to return. Entire families fled by sea, packed into makeshift boats, drifting across the South China Sea in search of freedom. They became known as the Boat People, a generation of survivors haunted by both victory and loss. For the United States, the war left wounds that never healed. It forced a nation to question its own power, its motives, and its morality. How could a country that won every battle lose the war? The answer lay not in jungles or battlefields, but in politics, pride, and the limits of force. Vietnam exposed what no bomb or general could conceal: that no amount of power can conquer a people fighting for their own destiny. Over time, the two nations would find a fragile peace. Diplomatic ties were restored in 1995, trade returned, and a new generation grew up knowing little of the bitterness their parents endured. Yet the ghosts remain in the rice fields where the ground still hides unexploded bombs, in the memories of veterans who still wake to the sounds of helicopters, and in the silence of those who never came home. The Vietnam War was more than a conflict. It was a mirror reflecting the cost of fear, the fragility of ideals, and the price of pride. And though its flames have long been extinguished, its lessons continue to burn, a reminder that wars fought in the name of peace often destroy the very peace they seek to protect. History remembers dates and battles, but it's the faces that linger: the farmer watching his village burn, the soldier writing his last letter home, the child who grew up under falling bombs. These are the true voices of Vietnam. If this story moved you, help us keep history alive. Like, comment, and subscribe to Erahive, where history speaks. Because every war may end, but every story deserves to be told.